All right, everybody, welcome to Hunting for Silver Linings. Today is Monday, December 7th, and we're joined by David Stengle of Startup Princeton, New Jersey. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We've done just around 70 of these little drop-ins to check in with different chapter directors from around the world. And one of the best things that we've been able to do is help inform our community, really kind of like who everyone is. These are like really great introductions. Sometimes we get to go to those big conferences. I was lucky enough to meet you in February.
Right.
And But a lot of us don't have the opportunities to get that face-to-face experience and party with one another. So let's start with an introduction based on like who you are, maybe a little bit about your background, and then how you found Startup Grind.
Sure. So I'm David Stengel. I'm 60 years old. I've lived in Princeton since 1997. I started really in the startup world probably in the late 80s. My first venture-backed startup I was employee one after two founders in a company that's still private but is over $1 billion in revenues now, and really caught the bug for doing startup work. So I had come to that company as a self-taught programmer, and back in the 80s, the PC revolution was taking off, and uh, wasn't really taught at universities in a meaningful way. So there are a lot of self-taught coders. Got a chance to play with the technology. Really fell in love with the speed and vibrancy of the startup market, and so worked at a number of startups. Spent a few years as the chief technology officer and one of the managing directors at an accelerator during the dot-com era. We did okay. We had a couple portfolio companies IPO. We had some companies just blow up in the crash. But I enjoy the operating side more, and I spent most of my career in some C-level role in enterprise software. So all the back office, plumbing, boring, transactional, high availability stuff, and did that in fintech and ad tech and financial services and telecommunications, different fields. Uh, in 2005, I joined a company called Black Arrow right after they took in their first investment, and stayed with them for 10 years. Ultimately, we sold to Cadent after raising about $80 million and growing globally. At that time, the company was headquartered in San Jose, California. I was living in New Jersey. I was flying to California every month. I was taking the train into New York when I wasn't flying to California, and that's about an hour and a half door to door one way. And I promised myself that my next startup, I would do something more local. And so in 2015, I reached out to the local community and started. Until that time, pretty much, if you lived in Princeton, I knew you because your kids played with my kids. That
Mhm.
was it. Or maybe if you live next door. But uh, and started going to meetups, applied to run a startup grind chapter, and it was just fantastic. I went to Global, which is this love bath for startups. It's just full of warmth and energy, and met you and hundreds of other people that I'm still in contact with in some way, shape, or form, and started hosting events. So Princeton is, last year, I think we were tied with Denver as the most active chapter in North America, and this year, with you can do the math however you want with virtual events. So
Mhm.
we've done a bunch of stuff, but New Jersey is an interesting market in that there's no hub in New Jersey. So New Jersey's a wealthy, well-educated state that has no nucleus. It's just every suburb has a strip mall and a high school with helicopter parents, so overachieving kids, and uh, a lot of interesting technology and fintech and life sciences. So started bringing in investors and founders to talk about what's it like, and going through the, do I have to leave New Jersey? Do I have to go to the big city? What makes sense? And uh, that sparked a real interest for me in small markets. So the companies that I'd done, uh, Black Arrow had, uh, blue chip investors, Polaris, Mayfield, Intel, and then strategics like Cisco and Comcast and Time Warner. Um, but it was really fly to the big city, kiss the ring. Uh, you know, the middle of the country doesn't exist. And I'm really a believer that uh, the startup mentality and the startup capability works not just for billion-dollar unicorns, but for much smaller businesses and much smaller markets. And Brad Feld, who's a person I think does some really interesting work in the startup space, one of the co-founders of
Mhm.
TechStars, says every community of 100,000 should have its own startup ecosystem. And so I've spent a lot of time working on the New Jersey ecosystem and getting to know the state, the investors, but also working on inclusion and how the startup community, which has been really good to me and I think is really shiny, uh, can be more welcoming to people that didn't go to an Ivy League school, and have friends and family that can
Mhm.
do a $5 million round. And so, well, that's a long answer, but that's sort of how I got here, right? And so I'm very much around community organization, wider access to startups, helping people navigate the. We were talking to maybe get personal with you before this recording started about being first time parent, and there's a whole bunch of things when you're a first time founder that it's not like the second one's easier, but you sort of know what you know and know what you don't know the second time. And the first time you don't know what you don't know, and you can really freak yourself out about all kinds of stuff, and just helping people navigate that process. So that's my deal.
Right. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of having that community that you're talking about, even even in a city like or a town like Princeton?
Yeah,
Because as you said, um, yeah, just because you've done it once doesn't mean that it's like automatic, right?
totally not. Totally not. So eh, one of the things that's been interesting to me looking at the startup scene since about 1990 when I tracked it is there's over the years there have been lots of well-intentioned and often mush-brained initiatives by communities around the world, including really big cities, to be, we're the Silicon Valley of whatever, right? We're the Silicon Valley of the UP, right? Like it's just, and that begs the question of how does startup ecosystems really form? And the answer from my perspective is network density. And network density means how much are people talking to other people and stimulating new thought, right? So there's a TED talk I really like that's a little salty, but I'm a little salty sometimes. And it's like good
Respect would do that to
good
you, right?
good ideas come from two ideas fucking, right? So the way to get new thoughts
Mhm.
is to get out there and put your ideas out for criticism and conversation and riffing. And so how do you do that? You you try to build communities where people have ideas that aren't fully formed and are comfortable talking about them, and have people that are comfortable engaging with that. And so getting that conversation going, that can be at co-working spaces, that can be uh, there's all different ways to do it, but that's the underlying principle to the things that I do around building startup ecosystem. It's like, get in the mix, get the schools talking to the businesses, get the businesses talking to the, I mean, and you'll get these things like the Chamber of Commerce, which is like,
Hmm.
hey, we have this print guide, you should buy space in our print guide. And it's like, well, that might have been good in 1975, uh,
Right.
but have the conversations. Uh, so I really think that wherever you are, it's about, what can I do to stimulate growth in network density of
Hmm.
conversation. There's a Swedish sociologist, now deceased, that is my favorite TED speaker. His name's Hans Rosling, and he talks about understanding global development. He's extraordinary. But one of the things that he does is, when he looks at a country, any country in the world, right, he will talk about life expectancy and GDP per capita, and then he'll say, this is the year that Sweden was there, right? So it's not Sweden is different than you. It's just we're at a different point on the
Hmm.
continuum. And there's a startup grind director, Alex Rodriguez in Barcelona, that has my favorite quote about trying to be in the startup ecosystem, which is, we don't want to be Silicon Valley. We want to be in the Champions League of startup communities. And I love that, because it says we can be great in our own way, right?
Hmm.
But we're not going to copy the conditions in California, because there are things about California that are special to California. And to try to imitate it, you're only ever going to be a pale shadow. But if you're trying to
Right.
be your own, so not everybody's a soccer fan, but your own Champions League
Hmm.
team, you can aim for greatness. So I think that's where it is. It's like, whatever community you're in, you
Hmm.
might have no startups, you might have no angels, and it's like, that's where you are. You're like Sweden in 1700, right? And then it's like, what do you do to take the next step? Because there's always a next step to get better, even for Silicon Valley, right? So,
Yeah.
so just have the intellectual integrity to look at yourself in the mirror and say, this is where we are, right? We have, like New Jersey, we're about 10th in the country on per capita venture investment, right? So great. That's top quintile if you squint really hard on a good year. But,
That's part of it, right? That's
but,
only part of what's necessary.
but it's like, okay, so this is where we are. What do we do to improve our game? Because everybody can improve our game. And that's the mindset, I think, to get there. Widening access and moving up the curve.
Well, I like your interpretation of what density means. A lot of people say that density is having the Silicon Valley, where where it's really just, I don't, if you have two people, let's get them together and provide the friction so that the ideas
Yeah,
can have babies, right? So density is not necessarily like a number of people. It's just like creating those opportunities for community um, and ideas. So that's
absolutely.
really awesome. Now, you mentioned a little earlier that you experienced a bit of a skills gap from like those at that time entering into the market.
Yeah.
Uh, Now locally with the uh, like are they staying local? Like people like these kids, like the sons and the daughters of the helicopter parents, are they staying local? Are
Yeah.
they in wings? Are they?
So I would say there's quarantine side, right? I mean, uh, when you're when you're 22, being in a suburban town with 10 or 20 traffic lights and a couple coffee shops isn't as cool as hanging out in an artist loft in Brooklyn, right?
Mhm.
And so there's this natural draw to the city for plenty of people. And I think it really uh, goes back to where do you find your bliss, right? So I had one of my events was a social media company founder. So it was a girl who founded a business in high school with her brother, and her older brother had already done one startup and been successful, and he came in and advised them, and that was 2005, and now they're publicly traded on Nasdaq, and um, but they stayed in pretty much the boondocks on the New Jersey Pennsylvania border for that whole time, and they have really low staff turnover, and they have 5-minute commutes, and that's the culture, right? And they're very serene about that. Like, this is the kind of people we're going to get, and if you want to go out and light it up at the club every night, you're not going to the woods out in Pennsylvania. Like, that's not your. But you can still make a niche, and I think it's much more important to have a clear sense of what you're about and who you're trying to attract. And then, I think there is, it's easier to have high levels of density when you're in a city. But in quarantine, it's more, we're all on Zoom, and that's how you're doing it. So, what's your level of willingness to be a connector online? And there are all kinds of ways, even if you don't know anybody, to get out and make connections. I mean, I do lunch club, right? So, as someone that got written up as a super connector, I still do lunch club once a week and meet some random person, and it's fun, and it's just a way to uh, don't. If you talk to the same people all the time, you're going to get into a certain groove, and that has advantages and disadvantages. But challenge yourself once in a while to bust out of that. So
Um, Now, if I am one of these sons and daughters of locally there, and I'm attracted to the area, I don't want to really leave, but
yeah,
I've got a great idea. Um, is it well known that okay, there is community here? I just have to reach out to David over at Startup Grind, or is is my university program going to connect me?
yeah.
Like
So
what are my
so
resources?
so in my experience, and as someone that didn't do a lot of marketing and just sort of held chapter events and was like, if you come, you come. And then after year 4, got a co-director who was gifted at marketing, and then more people came because marketing works. And uh, I think that uh, I feel established now, that I get calls, even people moving to the area, but that took years. And I think that uh, in any community, you can go look for resources, and there are going to be people that help you. So in New Jersey, the Economic Development Authority is actually really skilled and helpful, which is more than I expect of a government organization. But they're great people. They know the domain really well. And you can find resources. So you can find local resources and get a sense of uh, what local capital is available. And in small markets, usually it's a pretty short list, right? And then you can get guidance. There are just a ton of programs now, all more or less all virtual. So you can find resources and be pretty selective about what they are and what's available that's free. Um, I was listening to a talk by Michael Siebel, who runs Y Combinator, which is a premier accelerator. Uh, I would argue top three anyway. Um, and he was like, "Hey, we have all these resources online in our university that are free,
Hmm.
and if you study those, you'll know 10 times more than I did when I did my first startup." So like it's out there,
Yeah.
and the resources that you get from tech companies that have cloud businesses, you can just turn on all kinds of stuff for free. So
Hmm.
the good part about that is if you know what you're trying to build, you get a lot of free Tinker Toys. The bad part about that is you better know what you're going to build because you can spend a lot of time playing with Tinker Toys and have something that doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
And so I think the resources are there, and it's much more as a founder. What I'd say is, are you in the foxhole with people that you like and trust because you're going to spend a long time with them, and an intense time with them, and you're going to go through difficult
Hmm.
moments. And then, uh, are you in an environment in the whole product sense, in the uh, that you will really crank it and not be distracted, right? So there are startup founders. We had a startup in Princeton that did something that I think startups can do anywhere, which is, you know, the early team just rented a house, right?
You're right.
And they're in the house. Basically, they work there, they sleep there, they eat there, and it's not quite, slide pizzas under the door and come back in a year, but it's just, hey, we're going for it to be super focused, and you can do that anywhere.
Yeah. I like that show *Halt and Catch Fire*. Have you ever seen that at all?
I haven't.
It's that whole old school, like, beginning of Atari kind of
Yeah,
like rent a house and code till you die,
right.
and it's very it's of yore.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, so now I'm this young entrepreneur. I'm in the area. I can stay there. I have access to resources. Now it's pretty common that I'm going to need like a co-founder to match my
hmm,
what I don't have or what I don't know.
yep,
Is it fairly is that pretty common to be like, oh, look at this, there's
yeah.
a technical co-founder right around the corner?
I so I think it's very common, and the first thing I'd say is you'll get founders who say you have to have a co-founder, and you'll get investors that say you have to have a co-founder, and you'll get founders that say you don't.
Hmm.
It's a solitary business, and you'll get investors that are like, who's the lead dog, right? And so the reality from where I sit is what what's essential is that you're in some mode where you can really focus and crank on what you're trying to do. And any early stage startup, if you're really talking about from the beginning, right? From in the life cycle, from lust to dust, right? Right at the beginning, you have this gleam in your eye, I have this amazing idea. You are selling a dream at that point. And everything that you do in the early stages is about validating your assumptions and fleshing out what those assumptions are. And any startup that's not brain dead uh, has, if the things that we believe are true, we'll make a lot of money, and we execute, right? You have to execute, but if the market that we identified is the right market, and the pricing that we propose is the right pricing, and the cost of customer acquisition is the right, and the customer lifetime value is right, like if those numbers in the model are good, and then all you're doing, and it's not easy, is you're proving that all your assumptions are right. Because if your assumptions are right, then ka-ching, you make money. So it's Eric Ries, Lean Startup is, I think, literally wrote the book on this. Other people have said it, I think, less articulately for forever, but it's at the most important things at the beginning are understanding what you have conviction about, and that it validating that it's true. And then it's about traction. And, so you sell a dream until you can sell traction. And once you start selling traction, dreams are usually done.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's it. So when you think about it, the most common situation for me is, in my experience, is I have this great idea, but I'm not technical, and I need somebody to build it. And then you have to sell. You don't have to, but it's way better and cheaper and more likely to succeed if you can sell a technologist to join you and they have conviction too. And if you can't sell a technologist to join you on the technology, think about that. What's up with
Yeah,
that,
right.
right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
that's
Yeah.
it. That's an easier sell than an investor, or um, and if you're building a software product, or a SaaS product, or it's going to have technology, and you need to figure out how that goes. On the flip side, if you're the technologist and it's like, I can't, you know, uh, the joke about so you can say it about all different groups, but how do you tell the extroverted ones, the extroverted engineers, they look at the other engineer's shoes, right? So like if you're that guy that can't get up in front of a room and ask for money or ask for an order or sell, or but you have conviction, then you have to find somebody that can sell. And so it's pretty common to have a builder and a seller.
Yep.
um and it can be one person, it can be a group, but you're going to be in the foxhole with them for a decade, if it works. So you better like them.
Yep.
I like them in the not in the be friends, but in the you're comfortable working with them, you respect them, you trust them. You don't have to play with each other, you know.
Right. You can have the candor and openness that
But
is
yeah,
required.
you have to be able to call each other's bullshit, and you
Yeah.
have to be able to say, "Hey, you're having a tough week. What can I do to help?" That kind of stuff. Uh, and that that's it. So, find that person, but really think about it. I tell people in when I'm placing them for board seats, which is a much lighter commitment than being a co-founder, think of it as a 7-year marriage, right? So like if you're not willing to put the ring on, and say the next 7 years of my life, we're going to be, going down this road together, then maybe it's not the right person. So it's a pretty big step.
So now, so I found my co-founder, and we're getting along.
Hmm.
Idea is good, starting to get traction. Now it's
Yep.
time to build a team, right?
Yep.
So, um, Princeton being what I would assume, and you can tell me if I'm wrong because I don't know. Is it a fairly homogeneous community as far as how
Not.
things look
It's
demographically?
pretty close to the U.S. actually, on a composite basis. So Princeton, if you look at Princeton, the town, it's a little more peculiar than that because there's a big Ivy League school, Princeton, in the town of Princeton, and Ivy League schools have money falls from the sky everywhere, uh, and they pretty much do their own thing. So that if you're a Princeton student, you're going to get resources from the Princeton alumni community.
Mm-hmm.
Princeton literally has its own fund to invest in startups founders that went to Princeton. It has, an incredible list of mentors. It does things for Princeton students and alums, and that's great. Um, and then there's the 13 million people that live in New Jersey, right? And most of them didn't go to Princeton, and so there's venture funds in town. There's resources in town, and there's a network of 14 universities in the state that all have
Mm-hmm.
startup programs. So there's a little bit of interaction from the school to uh, the economy generally, but the school track is kind of its own thing that has a whole bunch of bespoke resources for students. And so I'd say if you're in a school program, take advantage of that stuff.
Hmm.
They're looking for wins. They're not
Right.
scored on venture returns. They will help you. Um, and if you're out sort of, hey, I dropped out of school to because I'm working on this business full time, then you're talking to the angel community, the investment community, and
Mhm.
getting validation there. Um, so I don't know if that's responsive to the question, but
Close. I'm. You brought out something that's interesting. So Princeton and New Jersey.
mhm,
So like Princeton, I'm in this community. I'm building my company here. So, but I have access to the talent pool in New Jersey, right? So
sure,
there's no crazy stigma where like, oh, I can't go to that ivory tower over there, or no, we won't look for talent down in that neighborhood. Because I know, and we're definitely going to talk about what you're doing with your efforts in inclusion in your company and
sure,
whatnot. So when we talk to talent development and building that balanced, diverse team, um, that's why I'm asking about
yeah,
talent for the region. And
yeah. So I mean, I have very strong and probably a little edgy views on all this stuff, right? So the 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 seductive temptation when you're starting a company, right? And you're pre-revenue, you have this idea, uh, and at the very beginning, usually people think you're crazy, and then 5 years later, they were like, "I knew all along you were gonna,"
all
right?
along,
Right?
I was there when we
Totally,
put a hamburger
totally. So,
outside.
so
Yeah.
the thing is, if you hire exclusively from your network, that's going to be the path of least resistance, but it's also going to severely constrict the network that your staff bring to you and your ability to grow beyond your own network because you're creating your own echo chamber. And
Hmm.
so I think it's really important to be intentional about culture and who you want to bring in and opening the search from employee 1, employee 5. By the time you get to 20, uh, you've baked the culture, and then it's like trying to take ink out of the pool. It's
Hmm.
very challenging. So think about uh, think about what you want your company to look like. Think about the values that you want to embrace, and if that includes diversity, if that includes making sure that your customers are represented in your employees, it depends on the business that you're in. If you're selling whatever 100-foot yacht rentals, you have one kind of demo. If you're selling
Hmm.
unbanked services in the third world, then maybe you should have somebody who grew up in the third world, right? Like or whatever. So thinking about that hiring from the beginning and challenging yourself, I think with your board appointments, with your advisors, with your first 10 hires, make sure you're getting at least some of the people from outside your network. Because if everyone comes from in your network, then like if this is your network, this is what you've added. Nothing, right?
Yeah.
And if you get people, I'm running out of screen, but you get the idea, right? Like you want to be able to have a bigger pool to draw on. And I think there are business benefits to that and hiring benefits to that. And in the quarantine era where you're hiring people virtually, uh, to my mind, uh, just look wider, right?
Right.
So think about,
Even ever.
yeah, yeah,
And
but
it's more affordable. So.
it's also if you're setting up somewhere, whether it's Michigan or New Jersey, and you want to have some local tie, think about why that's important to you, and then who it's going to resonate with. And that's going to, uh, and there are all different kinds of models that work just fine. There's a very successful and now late stage startup in Philadelphia, and I don't know if you can call them a startup anymore. They're making money and they're 10 years old, but they at like year 4, the co-founders said, we're going to a 4-day work week for the company, and if you want to work here, that's our model, right? So the total opposite direction of Jack Ma 996,
Mhm.
see your family when you're 70, uh,
Right.
model is like, you know what, 32 hours is plenty, and we'll kill it on 32 hours, and that's how we roll. And they've been able to attract some really good talent with that story, but they have clarity about what they're about, right? And that's different than, yeah, things aren't going well, so stay late, right? It's
Right.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're with Jack Ma. It's like, doesn't matter. Your work week is 72 hours to start, and if you're doing it over and above that, good for you. That's probably really normal, but
Right.
72 is the minimum.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, I think that's it. But be intentional about hiring. Don't don't uh don't just back into it of like, here's my uh here's my college roommates, from my floor. We're all set. Don't
Sure.
don't do that.
So, being in that small ecosystem there, uh, is the mindset to be reaching out of one's network? Is that where
Uh,
is that the trend? Like, have you guys?
I think it's extremely uh dependent on the founder. Uh so and the founders are uh an extremely wide ranging set of personalities, and right, like, so everybody everybody that's a real founder has got some hustle and some vision, um but how they go about it, how much they're an egomaniac, how much they're collaborative, how much it's all over the place. So think about what you care about. Think about what kind of advice you you need, and and be brave enough to listen to that advice, which is hard. There's this balance when you're a founder of, you've got to have conviction about what you're doing, and you've got to be able to listen to inputs from the outside. And balancing those two things can be really hard, because there are going to be people that say what you're doing is stupid. Well, if you just quit the first time you hear that, you'll never found a company. But if you persist for 10 years and $100 million without ever seeing a dollar of revenue, that's probably stupid too. So like, how do you exercise judgment around all that? It's tough. What I'd say is that um, the place that I try to reach is not really more than founders who haven't thought about being intentional about hiring, and to just say, look, this is an incredibly defining moment in the history of your company, and you should not take the path of least resistance here. You should think about who you're hiring and why, and what that means, and then own the result, because you're gonna
Mhm.
you're gonna live with that result no matter what. So that's um, and there are plenty of people. Uh, Often at the beginning, it's just hard to find anybody, right? It's like, I have no money. I want you to do some work for us.
Right. Yeah.
Will you work, evenings after your regular job for some options, and a pizza, and then, like, okay, well, who's
Yeah.
going to do that? It's
It's
harder,
only a work week, but it's on top of
right?
your 7-day work
And it's
week.
harder to ask a stranger. It's harder to get a stranger to do that, right? Like, you
Yep.
can you can go to a friend, and a friend, but it's still be extremely intentional about the people because uh, they will have such a profound long-term effect. Yeah.
So one of the last question here about the ecosystem there then is since we've discovered, we've learned from you that um, like there I won't, if I'm local and I'm relying on my local resources for my skills, I'm not going to have much of a skills gap when I get out. I'm going to have the resources available to me. I'm going to stumble into the cash when I need it if I have a good idea and traction and I've built a good team intentionally. And that's not hard to do because not only can I do it locally, but I also have all of New Jersey and also my neighboring region. Um, uh,
Yeah,
and
I'd
there's
still say it's hard. It's always
yeah,
hard, but
it's
it's
not easy.
possible,
It's
right?
not easy.
But there's a path.
However,
Yeah.
it's not like I'm in Cameroon
Right.
or like
Right.
so but and then then down the corner is follow-on funding, etc.
Yeah.
But what are so their challenges? What are the challenges in Princeton? Whether it's the ecosystem, how you would
Sure.
rather see it, or if I am a founder.
Sure. So, the challenges in Princeton and New Jersey generally, uh, so is you have to decide if you're going to stay centered in your local community forever and what your story is, and fundamentally, it will be uh, a somewhat contrarian story to New York, right? So New York's the second largest venture market in the world. It's the biggest city in the U.S.
Mhm.
There's a lot going on. So you need to appreciate that we operate in the shadow of New York. And then um, what else is so New Jersey has high labor costs, high housing costs. How are you managing uh, burn and what's the right equilibrium point? Uh, I don't think that's unique to New Jersey. That's probably true in any U.S. market to some degree. But um, but thinking about what do I need to have local, what don't I need to have local, um, how do I manage distance participation and culture around that so that I have a Ukrainian development team or a Vietnamese development team or customer care in the Philippines or whatever it is that I'm doing. Those parts of things. Then the other part that I think is local is understanding your funding steps, right? So while it's possible to wire money to anywhere in the world, the reality is capital is extremely local. And that's changing because of quarantine. Every fund I think I've talked to this quarter has deployed investments to companies they haven't met physically, but that's
Mhm.
really new. And the diligence process and understanding how to have those conversations with capital uh, is really important. And so I spend a fair amount of time working with companies on the extended conversation around how do I present my business to money. And so uh, when you think about as a venture backed startup, you need to take venture money to grow fast. And if you don't need to grow fast, don't take venture money because because it comes with certain obligations. So the best, for any founder, the best revenue is customer revenue, right? If they just write you checks and you can build your business on customer money and own your business, that's a happy path. If you need venture money, you need that story of this is why I have to grow fast. The market's forming quickly. It's new. There's a limited window. Competition is pouring in. It's a foot race. There's first mover advantage, whatever it is. Uh, and those are the challenges of uh, any market. So what's special to New Jersey? The weird thing about New Jersey is this no nucleus thing, right? So it's like I can find if I draw an hour circle, I can find people sort of uniformly spread out over that hour or 2 hour or whatever. And how do I filter my story to get the most attractive candidates and get candidates? So that balance. Uh, uh, but hiring, if you get hiring and customers, everything else works, right? So
Yeah. Um, well, thank you for enlightening us about what's going on there in Princeton.
sure,
It's like to be there in the ecosystem, swimming around.
yeah,
I do want to spend the last part of this hour getting into, what it is that Board Plus Plus is.
sure,
The quick sort of how that even came about
yeah. So
with someone with your deep background.
no, I'd love to talk about it. So I founded Board Plus Plus last year, and Board Plus Plus is about the problem of diversity on startup boards. So if you look at uh, public company boards, participation by women and minorities isn't good. There's been a little movement, more than a little movement. There's been meaningful movement in the last 25 years. NASDAQ recently announced that they're
Mhm.
requiring a woman on every board. We'll see how that goes. But if you compare venture backed companies to public companies, venture backed companies suck. The diversity, so 70% of startup venture backed startup boards have no women. Uh, the numbers for venture partners are in the high 80s for men. It's a rich white guy club, and because so much of what happens at the early stages. So if you look at the first two stages of funding for startups, the first round is friends, family, and fools, right? And it's
Mhm.
basically people writing you a check based on their knowing you. So if you didn't grow up in a rich family or go to a school where there were lots of rich people, you're on the outside looking in. And then the next round after that is uh, really a chemistry check at some level of, do I believe your story? And there are all kinds of numbers of, if you're a woman pitching and it's an all male room, uh, it's a chilly reception, that kind of stuff. So the idea here is venture markets have been pretty good at attacking certain problems. And they're problems that rich white guys can relate to. But there's lots of other things like, menopause or, just things that rich white guys might not be that good at. And that's the majority of the world's population are not rich white guys. So,
Mhm.
so if you're trying to go to the almost 8 billion people, you want to think about how to widen an aperture. And diverse groups make better decisions. So this is like global warming in 1990. It's like, if you want to look at the scientists, there was no mystery in 1990. But if you want to deny it, you can blow smoke and say, correlation's not causality. And so diverse groups perform better. They're not easier. They're stronger. And
Mhm.
and I think there's a level of complacency of, what, it's pretty comfortable being running a venture fund. It's pretty comfortable investing a couple percent of my big fund into as an LP into a venture fund. I don't need to rock the boat. But in my 30 years in startups, never had a woman on my board, right? In 30 years, and it was pretty much all rich white guys.
Mhm.
So the idea is, if you look at corporate America, even before uh, this year's, I mean, there's killings all the time. This killing caught popular attention in a different way for whatever reason. But even before that, big companies are struggling to attract, retain, and motivate underrepresented groups, right? So if you if you're entering the workforce now, the United States is not majority white. And so doing diverse hiring of 18-year-olds isn't that hard.
Hmm.
If you're looking at 50-year-old executives who've been, working their way up the corporate pyramid, it's pale, male, and stale, right?
Hmm.
So how do you get people that are in those organizations to uh, stay excited and feel like they have an upward path? And so the idea of Board Plus Plus is we go to big companies like Ford and say, "What are you doing for these people?" And they say, "We're working on it." And then you say, "Well, if they can join a startup board, that will exercise executive skills that will make them a stronger executive. It will help the startup, and it will help you get to know the startup industry." So it's a diversity win, it's a leadership development win, and it's a business development win for you. For the individual, it's a career builder. And for the startup, it's access to a big company in their industry that they're trying to sell to. So that's the
Hmm.
idea in a nutshell. And um, I do think we will see change, but it's slow. It's slow. So the thing that's got the most attention in the last year has been a number of funds that are just, you know what, we reject the establishment. We're raising our own fund to look at this different segment. But there's only a handful of companies, and that's up from nothing 3 years ago, that are focused on diversifying startup boards. And I encourage every startup listening to challenge yourself to diversify your board. Go outside, you know, as a founder, if you are passive about it, your investor will pick the board member and they'll probably pick it from their circle, which means you won't get a big
Right.
network effect. And
Hmm.
they'll probably vote with your investor if there's ever a conflict of interest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, get an independent, highly capable executive, and you'll be a stronger company for it. So that's the
So so like startups often have, even if they are getting their first round of funding or
yeah
second round of funding, they're the competition for those seats can be kind of heated, especially when you're taking cash. So um, when is the right time for a startup to reach out to you, to Board Plus Plus, and say,
yeah.
hey, we need to be thinking about this.
It's it's a good question. I think you can do it at as early as the pre-seed round. Um, but my advice really is often it's going to be a round before you populate the board, but you can cultivate.
Hmm.
My advice to any founder is line up a compelling independent board member as early as you can. Get to know them, get chemistry with them, and maybe you take them on first in your board of advisors or in a less formal relationship, but have them at the ready. And you will have a better chance of filling that seat and controlling uh, at least the board to some degree through that process, and you will be a stronger company for it. So it's never too soon, but by a round for sure.
Sure. Now, the tech talent industry is on fire, has been on fire for a while, right?
Yeah,
And so you kind of fit in that industry, yeah?
yeah, a little bit. I would say I bucket Board Plus Plus in talent development, right? So when you say tech, it's uh, I could play somebody that had marketing or legal, or it doesn't have to be somebody that came up from the CTO track. Uh, but but yeah, that's where we fit in.
Um, and if a startup were to identify working with you, it would be maybe even like it'd be an important signal, right? Kind of like a CEO joining the Action for Racial Equity Fellowship.
Sure, I'd be flattered if they looked at it that way. I mean, what I'd say is I'm happy to help any startup, and the commercial model of Board Plus Plus is it's all free to the startup, right? So start with that. But fill your board seat, take control of that process. Most startup boards are formed, not designed, and that
Hmm.
is totally suboptimal.
Hmm.
So if you're a founder, take control of that process. You will get good return on it.
I know we're at the end of our hour here, and I wish we could have more time, but I do end these conversations with one last question,
Sure.
and um, and it's really interesting asking this question of the more seasoned chapter directors, especially those who have seasoned careers. You're, as you said earlier, you're often called, like probably even on the phone, like
Yep.
directly with from your community with questions. And you're just nonstop asking people, how can I help you? And that's how I met you first, is you're just on the street corner asking everybody you see, how can I help you? Um, what can the global startup grind community do for David Stengel or the Princeton chapter?
So if you want to do, if you have a startup that wants to do business in New Jersey, please reach out. I'm happy to help. Those connections are good for me and good for the startups if they're done properly. I'd say what will help me the most is anyone that's looking to advance the conversation around board diversity. So that's if you have startups that are looking to form boards or to fill their boards with a more diverse group, or if you have relationships with big companies that are interested in leadership development, diversity and inclusion, and stronger ties to the startup community. I'd love to talk to you about any of that. And then more broadly, I would say the Princeton chapter really prides itself, our whole team, on widening access to the startup ecosystem. So anybody that's thinking about, hey, we only have this segment of our community coming to our events. What do we do around that? Love to brainstorm on ways to reach out, because I feel all of society can learn a lot from the startup ecosystem. So that's
Great. Um, Thank you very much. I really appreciate the generosity of your time and helping enlighten the global community on who you are, what you are, why you are, and a lot about Princeton too.
Thanks, Corey. It was really fun. Take care.
All right. Cheers, man.
Bye bye.